So tomorrow, Marc Caplan is giving a talk on campus. It's part of our lunchtime colloquium series, and everyone is invited. We always serve lunch and have a wonderful speaker. Tomorrow's talk will be on a 1923 short story written in Yiddish about race relations in the United States. It's a fascinating piece, and I'm sure Marc will illuminate it. His talk tonight is entitled Tevye Transformed, Sholem Aleichem, From Page to Stage to Film. Please join me in welcoming Marc Caplan.
Thank you all for this wonderful welcome. This is my first visit to the Twin Cities area. April, huh? That's it's remarkable. Let me just clarify that the coldness of the outside temperature is matched in equal measure by the warmth of the reception that I've received while I've been here. I have not shivered once, thanks to the hospitality that I've received from so many quarters and so many people that I can only begin to thank, because if I thanked everybody in the measure that they deserved, that would be the whole lecture. But let me please begin by thanking Leslie Morris for the invitation, for the really, really lovely introduction that I've received tonight, and for all the events that she's organized. It's really, really gratifying as a writer and as a critic and as a teacher to know that somebody has read one of my articles. That's just, I never had heard that before. You actually read it, thank you. I also want to thank Mariel Coulter for all of the necessary and invaluable, and from my perspective, and I know that this is an illusion, seemingly effortless work that I know took a lot of work to actually coordinate to get me here and to enable me to meet with you, to speak with you, and to participate in the life of both the university community and the Jewish community while I'm here. It's incredible. Thank you to Natan Paradise, to Rabbi Davis at Darkei Noam, to the Shapiros for their Shabbat hospitality for me, to my once and future student, Mayor Weinschel, for showing me around campus and spending time with me and introducing me to some of his own colleagues in the graduate cohort of the Department of German, Scandinavian Languages, and Dutch, in addition to the really, really tremendous faculty that is here for the Jewish Studies program. You have so many wonderful academic, intellectual, and spiritual resources in this community, and it's just very, very gratifying and a real honor for me to participate this weekend. Let me finally thank you all for coming. This is 10 times the audience I usually receive. And I know that, on a Monday night, there are a lot of other things that you could be spending your time doing. And I know on a cold night, in the aftermath of a blizzard, there are a lot of incentives just to, get in your pajamas and heat up some hot chocolate. And I would like to be doing that too, don't get me wrong. But the fact that you came out tonight just really, really means tremendous to me. I hope that by the end of the evening, this will have been transformed from a lecture into a conversation, because the reason why I do what I do is to provoke a dialogue with the people who are interacting with my work. And I think that principle of dialogue, of conversation, of exchange really speaks to the heart of what attracts me specifically to Yiddish culture and to the figure of Sholem Aleichem, who we're going to be talking about in some detail tonight. Dialogue is really what makes Yiddish a distinctive culture and a distinctive literature, and I want to elaborate on what I mean by that principle in the course of my prepared remarks. Now, I'm going to mostly speak. We have a couple of video clips. I hope that those will be entertaining in a way that my own remarks cannot hope to be. And afterwards, to the extent that you have energy, patience, or interest, I'd like to have some questions and answers. And again, what I would aspire to a conversation. So let's begin. The task of discussing the transformation of the Tevye character from Yiddish fiction to its subsequent adaptations on stage and in film, both in Yiddish and in English, by considering a remark of the great German Jewish philosopher Theodor Adorno, who would probably be spitting in his grave now if he knew that he was being invoked in the context of Yiddish comedy. But Adorno once wrote about the composer Johann Sebastian Bach, and I quote, "Bach is degraded by impotent nostalgia to the very church composer against whose office his music rebelled and which he filled only with great conflict." The essay in which this comment appears is titled "Bach Defended Against His Devotees." And with this statement in mind, I would consider as an alternate title to my observations this evening, Sholem Aleichem Defended Against His Adapters. For in each context that we find Sholem Aleichem's work presented on stage and in film, we find this greatest of Yiddish writers transformed into something that he was not, degraded not by what Adorno calls impotent nostalgia, but perhaps even more insidiously by ideological agendas and counter-agendas, tendentious simplifications, and impatience with the subtlety and the tentativeness of the author's worldview. My hope this evening is to begin to peel off some of the layers of grease paint that have distorted Sholem Aleichem's image in the popular imagination, and in so doing to recognize him for the sensitive, subtle, and subversive author that he truly is. By way of introduction, I want to speak a little bit about Sholem Aleichem himself. Sholem Aleichem, as many of you know, is the pen name and the persona of Sholem Rabinovich, who was born in the Ukraine in 1859 and died in the Bronx in 1916. Like Samuel Langhorne Clemens, whose alter ego Mark Twain is often invoked in discussions of Sholem Aleichem, Rabinovich creates a separate personality for his literary work, a folksy, deceptively satirical presence that invites intimacy with his readers while holding a mirror up to reflect the society that he and his audience share. The Tevye character first appears about 10 years into Sholem Aleichem's career in 1894. At the time, there was no reason to suspect that he would eventually become the most famous character in all of Yiddish literature. In fact, in the 1899 monologue, Aboidim, best translated by Hillel Halkin as Tevye Blows a Small Fortune, Sholem Aleichem pairs his dairyman with what was to date his most popular recurring character, Menachem Mendel, a hapless business speculator and the prototypical Luftmensch. This story provides its companion to the previous monologue, the 1895 story Das Große Gewinns, Tevye Strikes It Rich. In the earlier story, Tevye explains how he went from being an impoverished logger to a relatively prosperous dairyman, thanks to the financial reward of an unnamed magnate for whom Tevye had performed a simple favor. In Aboidim, Tevye squanders most of his windfall on one of Menachem Mendel's characteristically harebrained investments. The coupling of Tevye with Menachem Mendel suggests that Tevye functions as country mouse to Menachem Mendel's city mouse, a traditional Jew with no better grasp of the tradition than Menachem Mendel, a supposedly modern Jew, possesses of modernity. In the following story, Heintige Kinder, Today's Children, also published in 1899, Sholem Aleichem hits on the formula that will enable Tevye to expand beyond the limits of his initial typecasting and dominate the author's subsequent creative output. Today's Children tells the story, already familiar to most of us from Fiddler on the Roof, of Tevye's reluctant, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to arrange a marriage between his eldest daughter Zeitel and the much older butcher Laser Wolf. This is the most faithful of Fiddler's many plot lines to the Yiddish original, and all the elements in the musical, including the preposterous dream that Tevye fabricates to convince his wife Golda to accept Seitel's choice of the tailor Muttel Kumzoil as her husband, are present in the original. With each of the successive 4 monologues, written between 1904 and 1909, Tevye describes how his subsequent daughters become engaged to a new suitor against his wishes, and how each marriage contributes to a further erosion of traditional values and communal stability. Through this device, Sholem Aleichem hits upon the most effective means of his career for dealing with the central theme of modern Jewish literature, the generation gap between parents and children, and the crisis this conflict creates or represents between tradition and modernity. Already in the first decade of the 20th century, literary critics, first Russian language ones reading Sholem Aleichem in translation, and only thereafter Yiddish language intellectuals, began comparing the Tevye of these stories with Job and King Lear, far afield from the schlemazel and buffoon of the first stories, and from the narrowly localized perception of Yiddish literature up to that point. It's entirely proper, however, to recall and concur with Sholem Aleichem's contention that Tevye remains essentially unchanged throughout this sequence of stories. Indeed, Tevye is entirely of a piece with nearly all of the speakers in Sholem Aleichem's monologues. We can also liken Tevye to the protagonist of a situation comedy, to the extent that it is no more fanciful to imagine that the legacy of Sholem Aleichem's literary production it can be found as much in contemporary television as in latter-day Jewish American or Hebrew literature. Like Ralph Cramden, Archie Bunker, Homer Simpson, or Peter Griffin, Tevye is unfinished and incomplete, aspiring for the stars, yet incapable of changing his circumstances. He is a traditional Jew, but also a marginal Jew in his social status and his relationship to traditional authority. He uses his inexhaustible verbal energy to subdue his adversaries and to protect himself from the most frightening and dangerous threats confronting him. That is, language functions for Tevye, like most of Sholem Aleichem's characters, as a weapon. Characteristic for Tevye, more than the author's other characters, is his extravagant use of classic Jewish sources, inevitably misquoted and out of context, but connected to the situation at hand by Tevye's wildly inventive exegesis. As when Tevye explains in Today's Children, quote, "There I sat staring up at the sky and thinking of the words of the Hallel prayer. Hashamayim, Shamayim, Ladai Shem, the heavens belong to God, V'ha'oretz nusen livnei odom. But the earth he's given to us, the human race, so that we can bury each other 6 feet deep in it and fight for the honor of crying over the grave." Beyond the undeniable humor and creativity of Tevye's citations, these references to the tradition underscore this character's marginality and limitations. Nearly all of Tevye's quotations come from the Daily Prayer Book, the High Holy Day Prayer Book, or the Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers. The narrow range of these sources indicates that Tevye has in fact received only a minimal Jewish education, and his propensity to recontextualize his quotations suggests that even in these fundamentals, he wasn't the most serious or attentive of students. Moreover, Tevye is not typical of Eastern European Jews insofar as he lives in a village, a dorf, rather than a small town or a shtetl. The difference between village and small town, as I insist to all of my students, and they only rarely get the distinction right, is not merely a semantic distinction, but rather refers to the respective absence or presence of an organized Jewish community. A shtetl, unlike a village, would have a rabbi, a Jewish cemetery, a ritual bath, educational institutions, synagogues, and a hierarchical social infrastructure. A village, by contrast, would not only have none of these communal institutions, but would also have very few Jews. And indeed, one of the reasons why Tevye habitually talks to God, or his horse, or Sholem Aleichem, is because there's no one else around with whom he can speak. And certainly not anyone with whom he can speak in Yiddish. By situating Tevye in a village, therefore, Sholem Aleichem simultaneously places him on the margins of Eastern European Jewish society and removes him from the pettiness and parochialism depicted in conventional Yiddish satire. By placing Tevye outside the shtetl, Sholem Aleichem gives the character the space, the breathing room, to transcend the previous limits of Yiddish fiction. Nonetheless, another characteristic that Tevye shares with the speakers in Sholem Aleichem's other stories is his capacity for self-deception. Tevye prides himself on his commitment to Jewish learning, yet he barely musters the equivalent of a 6th grade education. With each of his 5 daughters, he claims a special, unique relationship, yet he is always surprised and outraged when she chooses a spouse. Repeatedly, he insists, Tevye is no woman, meaning that he is given neither to public displays of emotion nor indulgent chatter. Yet we know precisely from the narration of his stories both how dependent he is on the emotional release that talking provides him and how deeply his daughter's decisions have wounded him. Most significantly, despite his self-perception as a victim, both of historical circumstance and filial betrayal, the reader knows that Tevye, like all truly tragic heroes, has in each story created the conditions for his own heartbreak. To illustrate one central aspect of Tevye's ambivalence as a character, let's consider his attitude toward money. The famous song, If I Were a Rich Man, from Fiddler on the Roof, accurately captures one recurrent theme in the original stories: Tevye's desire for wealth and his hopes of achieving a life of honorable leisure through the profitable marriage of at least one of his daughters. But as the original stories unfold, the reader realizes that Tevye's attitude toward money is much more complicated than the traditional practice of using children in arranged marriages essentially as commodities would suggest. In Tevye Strikes It Rich, for example, when Tevye first comes into contact with the wealthy man who providentially changes him from a logger to a dairyman, we see Tevye literally shrink into the shadows when confronted with such extravagant wealth. Quote, "You can imagine what went through my mind," he says. "The crumbs that fell from that table alone would have been enough to feed my kids for a week, with enough left over for the Sabbath. Oh, my dear Lord," I thought, "they say you're a long-suffering God. They say you're a merciful and a fair God. Perhaps you can explain to me why is it that some folk have everything and others have nothing twice over?" "Wait a minute," I heard someone say. "What happened to the coachman? Has the Shlemazel left already?" "God forbid," I called out from where I was. "Do you mean to suggest I'd simply walk off without so much as saying goodbye? Good evening. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Enjoy your meal." I can't imagine why you wouldn't. "Come in out of the dark," says one of them to me. "Perhaps you'd like a little brandy." "A little brandy," I say. "Who can refuse a little brandy? God may be God, but brandy is brandy. L'chaim." And I emptied the glass in one gulp. God should only help us to stay rich and happy, I say, because since Jews can't help but being Jews, somebody had better help them. Among the mix of emotions and inflections that we can perceive in this passage, one notes particularly Tevye's feelings of envy and intimidation in the presence of the wealthy family's conspicuous consumption. To cover up these potentially hostile feelings, Tevye quickly plays the role of a gregarious raconteur with jokes and proverbs at the ready to entertain his audience as they entertain us as readers and distract them from the awkwardness of his position in their company. And though he attributes the difference in their social status and his to God, he nonetheless provides the reader with enough detail about these discrepancies to call attention to the emergence of class conflict among the different strata of East European Jewish life. Most significantly, his impulse in the presence of these rich Jews, when they are not paying attention to him, is to lurk in the shadows. And we can understand in a certain sense that it is in these shadows and not at center stage where the actual narration of his monologues always takes place. This passage occurs in one of the first of the Tevye stories, at a time when Sholem Aleichem first envisioned Tevye as another in a long line of hapless, confused, and comic characters. Nonetheless, Tevye's attitude toward wealth never changes over the course of the sequence or series. In the tragic story Sprinze, written 12 years later in 1907, Tevye's fourth daughter becomes romantically involved with and probably even pregnant by an indolent and rich assimilated Jew spending the summer near Tevye's home. Characteristically, it was Tevye who brought the young man into his house and provided the introduction to his daughter. When the suitor's family hears word of the affair, however, an uncle intervenes with Tevye to end the relationship, as Tevye explains. He didn't stop chewing my ear off. If I thought I could bilk his sister, I had another thing coming. Although, with a bit of goodwill on my part, she was certainly good for a few rubles, a charitable gesture, so to speak. And would you like to know what my answer to all that was? My answer, the shame of which I'll never live down to my dying day, was nothing. My tongue clove to my mouth, as the Bible says. I simply rose from my chair, went to the door, and exit Tevye. I went over to my wagon, laid my head on it, and promise you won't laugh at me, I cried until I had no tears left. Once again, we see Tevye intimidated in the presence of wealth, and in the absence of a role to play or a clever response to offer, he slinks off into the shadows. Tevye has always used his storytelling in quotations as a defense mechanism against the larger forces that threaten him. And in the absence of this defense, he is utterly powerless. Moreover, not only does he not confront the family that betrays his daughter, he also fails to discuss the incident with his daughter herself. What she, my daughter, went through, no one knows but me, because I was her father, and a father knows in his heart. Don't imagine, though, that she ever said a word to me about it. Do you think she complained? Do you think she cried even once? If you do, you don't know Tevye's daughters. Though Tevye expresses pride in his daughter's ostensible stoicism, which, as he claims, reflects his own inability to articulate his emotions, at the end of the story, she throws herself into the river and drowns. Unsurprisingly, this plotline figures in none of the adaptations of the Tevye stories for the stage. The next story, however, suggests that there is an even worse fate than death. In Tevye Leaves for the Land of Israel, which appeared in 1909, his youngest daughter, Belke, finally accedes to the wish Tevye had cherished since Seitel broke her engagement to marry Motel Komzoil, that one of his daughters betroth a rich Jew through a traditional matchmaker. With his fondest wish fulfilled, Tevye comes to discover that his daughter is trapped in a loveless marriage to a hypocrite, and he speaks nostalgically of his second daughter Hodel's marriage to a Marxist revolutionary, even though Hodel and her husband are now living in Siberia as punishment for his subversive activities. When Belke sets up house in Yechupetz, Sholem Aleichem's comic name for Kiev, her vulgar and ignorant husband Podotzer informs Tevye that his position among his business contacts would be imperiled if it became known that his father-in-law were a simple dairyman, and therefore Tevye must leave home for America or for Palestine. Instead of holding his tongue and slinking off in silence, Tevye seems finally to summon the words to respond to this son-in-law's outrageous demand. Look here. I don't hold it against you that you think the Talmud is mumbo-jumbo. When a Jew sits in Yechuppetz expecting Rothschild to drop by, he can afford to keep the Talmud in his attic. Still, even you can surely understand a simple line of scripture, such as every Russian peasant boy knows. I'm referring, of course, to what Onkelos has to say in his Targum, about what the Bible has to say in the book of Genesis, about Lovan the Aramean, miznavto dechazirto loy machmen straimilto. I'm afraid, he says, looking at me sideways like a rooster. That's a bit over my head. What does it mean? It means, I say, you can't make a fur hat out of a pig's tail. Use that, future reference. In fact, this is one of only 2 instances in the entire series where Tevye actually fabricates a quotation. An absurd mixture of pseudo-Aramaic syllables and the Yiddish words streimel and machtmen. Seen from one perspective, this exchange finally provides Tevye with the upper hand in his conflict with a wealthier and more powerful Jew. Tevye responds to the nonsense of the nouveau riche buffoon with his own brand of nonsense. But insofar as this nonsense draws on the language of tradition, or at least what sounds like the language of tradition, and the common sense of ordinary people, it elevates Tevye and invests his position with dignity. And the fact that even an invented quote that merely sounds like Aramaic is enough to fool Podotzer indicates the distance that Tevye has traveled in just 15 years. In that time, a new generation of Russian Jews has come of age who know so little of the tradition that Tevye's minimal education is, by comparison, masterful. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man becomes king. But seen from another perspective, can't we also argue that Tevye is here again debilitated by his problematic relationship to money and Jews whom he can't help but consider his social superiors? For instead of answering Podotzer in the genuine language of the tradition or simply speaking his mind, isn't Tevye actually reduced here to mouthing meaningless and incoherent sounds? Hasn't the presence of wealth caused Tevye's tongue, in spite of his after-the-fact bluster, to cleave once again to the roof of his mouth? And indeed, doesn't Tevye, when all is said and done, acquiesce to Podotzer's ridiculous demand, preparing to exile himself from Belka, just as Hodel had exiled herself from him? It is important in this context to reiterate that as a character, Tevye remains unchanged from the beginning of the series to the end. He never modifies either his stated values or his mode of expression. The structure of his monologues remains essentially constant. The family dynamic among Tevye, Golda, and their daughters never varies. And most crucially, Tevye never learns from his previous mistakes, or even acknowledges that they were mistakes to begin with. What changes in these stories isn't the protagonist, but rather the circumstances surrounding him. And yet, Tevye is the clearest and most dramatic illustration of what my teacher Dan Miron has referred to as the dark side of Sholem Aleichem's laughter. And he is the character who can most effectively shoulder the tragic burdens affecting Jews in the first decade of the 20th century. After all, Sholem Aleichem's character Menachem Mendel is, like Tevye, a character who evades familial responsibilities, uses language to insulate himself from the enormous reality of his failures, and is spun repeatedly out of control by circumstances that he barely understands. And yet, Menachem Mendel never invites our identification the way that Tevye does. His financial pratfalls inspire our laughter, but never our tears. Tevye affects his readers emotionally because we see him cut off from a larger community and therefore alone in his fate. But also because his central preoccupation, in spite of his profound emotional limitation, is his children and his inability to communicate with them. Furthermore, his constant engagement with religious tradition and with God connects him more profoundly than Sholem Aleichem's other characters to the tragedies and hopes of Jewish history. And because Tevye is able to engage simultaneously our comic as well as our tragic sensibilities, he is the ideal character to make the leap beyond the printed page and onto the stage. We will therefore turn now, as Tevye puts it in his monologues, from the prince to the princess, from Tevye as a fictional character to the adaptations of Tevye on stage and on screen. The first such adaptation was actually completed by Sholem Aleichem himself in 1914, when the author was already established, however precariously, in America, and while he was at work on the last completed story in the sequence, Lech Lecha, which describes Tevye's final expulsion from his home. The stage version of the Tevye stories concentrates exclusively on 2 episodes from the Tevye monologues: the decision of Tevye's third daughter, Chava, to marry the non-Jewish village scribe Chvedka Galagan, and the expulsion of the Jews from Anatevka. Each subsequent adaptation has likewise focused primarily on these 2 episodes. In the interest of dramatic closure, Sholem Aleichem has Chava, whom Tevye disowns after her marriage and her conversion to Christianity, return to the family and the Jewish religion in response to the expulsion edict. This is not something that is explicitly narrated in any of the stories, but it's made explicit when Sholem Aleichem adapts it to the stage. In the process, he makes the Chava of this play perhaps the most interesting and compelling representative of the younger generation in his entire body of work. That is to say, most of Sholem Aleichem's greatest writings focus either on very, very young children or on elderly and marginal figures from the tradition. But in explaining her decision to return to the family, Chava, for once, gets to speak for herself, as she never does in the monologues. And she tells her sister Tzeitel, "I'm not asking for anyone to forgive me. I'm not a penitent," a Baal Tshuva Nitza in the original, seeking atonement. "I never sinned against anyone except myself, and I never hurt anyone other than myself." Chava's suggestion that she has never left Judaism despite her formal conversion to the Eastern Orthodox religion, and that she has therefore never sinned against her faith or her family, is a fairly radical argument for a Jewish identity outside the parameters of Jewish law. And no other character speaks so effectively for such an identity anywhere else in Sholem Aleichem's writing. The Chava of this play returns to her family on her own terms, and this act of return, in a dramatic sense, seems not only to be an act of solidarity against the larger forces arrayed against Jews at that time, but even a gesture toward victory for both the older and the younger generations. The next adaptation occurs in 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II, when times were even worse for the Jewish people than they had been in 1914. This adaptation is the film Tevye, directed by and starring the greatest of American Yiddish actors, Maurice Schwartz. And although it was filmed entirely on Long Island, it uses the Chava story to speak explicitly to the anxieties that American Jews felt toward non-Jews in general and toward their erstwhile Eastern European neighbors in particular. I'm going to show a clip now from the 1939 Tevye film. It lasts about 5 minutes.
gekommen und alle freuen sich mit den Zerkassenen. Hey, Chlopti!
Ihr seid keine nicht. Was von die Augen mir verlaufen mit Steu. Und erst haben sie behalten dort oben, in der obersten Garnitze. Ach, die Gott, und ihr schön seid erlebt, der Älter. Schön.
Tevye, sonst kannst du wissen, mit dem wir so zu reden. Ihr zittert das Herz, weil Thomas Cholile habst du doch heraus mit deinem Apusik, sind wir im Glücklich. Mitgitten, Tevye, mitgitten. Nur nicht schreien.
Ich schreie, ne? Wo denn soll ich ziehen, sich einfach wegstellen und tanzen? Was aber mir wegnehmen ist das Beste, das Schönste, was ich vermog. Wo soll ich ziehen? Wo soll ich ziehen? Schwagen soll er. Schwagen soll er! Batjuschka! Batjuschka, Menschen sollen gekommen, Menschen!
Tevye! A Gast, a seltener Gast. Als du bist du, wenn wir trinken Tee. Avdotja, du garois dem Samovar auf dem Garnik.
Geh, setz dich weg, trink in Tee mit ihm. Ehrlich,
A Gast, a teuer Gast, Tevye. Komm zum Tisch, wenn wir trinken Tee. Setz dich, Tevye. Setz dich, Tevye, Lecher. Maar de heimisch, Tevye. Also wie bei sich in der Heim. Dort werden wir bald trinken Tee. Ah.
Nein, Batjuschka. Ich bin gekommen bei dir sitzen und ich trinke keinen Tee. Ich bin auch gekommen, ich stelle etliche Fragen, dass mir entfernen und redlich und nun chitrosten. Die gedenkst du die Manse von dem Urmann Schäferle, wo der Nuge dort weggegasselt?
Ihr gedenk.
Gedenkst, ha? So weiß ich, als du bei dir in Stieb gefindest sich mein Kind. Mein Chave. Mein Urm Schäfer und ich will mein Kind zurück.
Tevye, ob Gott in Haus.
Oh, komm mal nicht. Ich will mein Kind. Batjuschka, ich will mein Kind, mein Chave will ich. Chave! Chave, Tochter, Chave! Chave!
Bitte, los, bitte.
Ja, was kann ich tun, wenn ich gehe?
Mord, mach Tevye. Jeden Tappens Kohl rief nach. Rabe schreit er. Rabe!
Du wächst sich also zu hängen zu mir? Weißt du, vor wem du stehst? Du stehst vor dem Kaisers Diener. Vor dem Beschützer in der heiligen Zerkwe.
Jewitschka, ne Schume meine, du hast ein zu viel geweint. Du musst sich äußern vor der Zeremonie. Du setzt sich weg, du. Treibele meins. Oh, das soll. Nu schau, Treibele. Lubin.
Batjuschka. Obrachmunes. Lieber Kik. Du sagst, Obrachmunes. Oh, Beber. Batjuschka hier. Oh, Beber. Batjuschka.
Батюшка, сердце таяло.
Tevye, die soll sich also erniedrigen. Ein Mensch für einen Menschen.
redest du mir für Menschen und für Menschlichkeit. Sag mir, Batschka, ob ich eine Hoffnung zu sehen, mein Kind zurück. Ha?
Bade. Aber nicht jetzt. Später.
Nee, nicht später, noch erzählt, Batschka. Erzählt, wenn ich sehe, mein Kind, die Rege, die mir nicht.
Du wirst nicht da reingehen, Tevye.
Ich will jagen. Ich will gehen sogar. Die Erste, ich will gehen sogar.
Nicht gehen.
Ich will gehen sogar. Ich habe Tochter, Menschen, Gewalt, Gewalt.
Weg von dannen. Die Tunnel.
Mama.
Now, the production values of what we've just seen pale in comparison with Fiddler on the Roof, needless to say, as most films in 1939 would. But this is nonetheless one of the best Yiddish films ever made, and there's actually much in it worth seeing. The dances and the costumes that we saw from the Ukrainian wedding are impeccably authentic. One imagines how much the original audience in theaters, both in the United States and in Europe, would have delighted in seeing the way that the actor playing the priest, Jacob Adler, who was the father of Stella Adler, the great acting coach, and the equal of Maurice Schwartz in his prominence in what we would call Yiddish Kunsttheater, the Yiddish art theater. The way that he cherishes his samovar would have no doubt evoked many memories for the original audiences watching it. The use of camera angles is both artistically and dramatically as sophisticated as what one would find in an English language film of the era. And Schwartz himself transforms Tevye into a figure of Shakespearean grandeur, never more than in the silent pantomime with which he falls to his knees in utter abnegation and stands up reclaiming his manhood, his masculinity, not just as an individual, but as a representative of the Jewish people. At the same time, one can scarcely excuse even a film made in 1939 of the use of stereotypes that pervade the depiction of Jewish and non-Jewish relations. In one scene, entertaining bride and groom with a wrestling match, drinking themselves into a stupor, and generally behaving either like bulls or pigs. More generally, the film moves from tragic nobility to maudlin sentimentality to grotesque low comedy in the bat of an eye. And if we had kept watching, we would have seen that. The constant shuttling among these hyperbolic emotions can only be attributed to the logic of the Yiddish theater. Immigrant audiences apparently wanted all of their emotions stirred up in a larger-than-life fashion, served all at once in a way that we find disturbing nowadays. Although our contemporary sensibilities are thus uncomfortable with the way the film portrays non-Jews, just as we would be uncomfortable with the depictions of Japanese people in propaganda films of the same era, beyond any question of what we might call political correctness, there is a problem here of dramatic credibility. The Ukrainians in this adaptation are so monstrously grotesque that we never believe that Chava would consent to marry one of them in the first place. Schwartz enjoys himself too much, exploiting the stereotypes of non-Jews to develop a genuine dramatic resonance to the situation that he depicts. Such caricature not only does a disservice toward non-Jews and the complicated, fraught interactions between Jews and non-Jews throughout Eastern European history, but ultimately undermines a serious portrayal of intermarriage itself. In psychological and in dramatic terms, this scene is overdetermined in foreclosing every option other than acquiescence to the law of the father. The next and most famous adaptation of Tevye, and we could talk about its own idiosyncratic and circuitous stage history, but of course, the next version or the next chapter in the story is the Broadway adaptation that debuted in 1964, Fiddler on the Roof, which of course is based on 4 stories from the Tevye cycle, even though its title alludes to a painting by Marc Chagall. It was the most successful Broadway musical of the 1960s, and it achieved blockbuster status when it was adapted again as an Oscar-winning movie in 1971. Fiddler on the Roof is literally the musical with 9 lives, and one might even suggest that it is on the verge of a 10th life, with a revival of an Israeli production of the musical coming to New York this season, translated back into Yiddish, believe it or not. The fact that actors as distinct and distinctive as Zero Mostel, Chaim Topol, and even Harvey Fierstein can portray Tevye to popular acclaim is evidence not only of the show's universality, but also of its elasticity. Fiddler is, of course, a distorted depiction of turn-of-the-century Yiddish culture, even though scholarly accuracy was never one of the selling points for Broadway musicals. Do you think medievalists gain a sense of their material from watching Camelot? Critics have often spent so much time belaboring its inaccuracies, however, that they typically overlook its strength as a performance piece, as well as the portrait it paints, what we might call the period piece that it represents more subtly of American Jewish culture in the middle of the 20th century. This oversight, in fact, seems to be in the midst of correction. Fiddler itself has received critical attention recently from such American cultural critics as Stephen J. Whitfield and Elisa Solomon, the latter of whom has written that Fiddler, once castigated as the definitive example of American Jewry's sentimentalization and estrangement from East European culture, has become, for many baby boomers, the closest we ever came to spiritual sustenance. Despite such revisionist talk of Fiddler as a spiritual experience, the actual joys of the musical are physical and indeed corporeal. The real star and creative genius of Fiddler is its choreographer, Jerome Robbins. Consider the famous production number, and I'll show it right now, To Life, L'chaim. Itself almost the only non-Jewish word to appear in the musical. Now, I'll play the clip now, and I just want to parenthetically state that the natural counterpart to the clip I just showed you from the 1939 movie would be the performance piece of the song Sunrise, Sunset, which also takes place at a wedding. And I'm not going to show you that clip because I have a 13-year-old daughter, and let me put it this way. My doctor has put me on a low schmaltz diet. So let's watch this instead.
Prosperity. To our good health and happiness. And most important of all, well, to life, l'chaim. L'chaim, l'chaim, to life. Here's to the father I've tried to be.
Here's to my bride to be.
Bring l'chaim to life, l'chaim. L'chaim, l'chaim, to life. Life has a way of confusing us,
Blessing and bruising us.
Bring l'chaim to life. God would like us to be joyful, even when our hearts lie panting on the floor.
How much more can we be joyful when there's really something to be joyful for?
To life, l'chaim. To Zeitel, my daughter,
My wife! It gives you something to think about.
something to drink about. Drink l'chaim. To life.
Yes?
Portrait. Drinks for everyone. What's the big occasion? I'm taking myself a bride.
Who's the one?
Tevye's eldest, Zeitel. To Laser Wolf, to Tevye.
To Zeitel, your daughter.
My wife.
May all your futures be pleasant ones, not like our present ones. Drink l'chaim to life, l'chaim.
L'chaim.
L'chaim to life. It takes a wedding to make us say, let's live another day. Drink l'chaim to life. We'll raise a glass and sip a drop of schnapps in honor of the great good luck that favored you. We know that when good fortune favors two, such men it stands to reason we deserve it too. To us and our good fortune, be happy, be healthy, long life. And if our good fortune never comes, kiss to whatever comes. Drink the fire to
I could dance like that, I just don't feel like it. That's pretty irresistible, I think. Now, to return to the scholarly critique of this adaptation, to bring it down a notch. This scene, which conveys the premature celebration of Tevye's betrothal of Seitel to Lezer Wolf, never occurs in Sholem Aleichem's stories, and it's unlikely that Jews actually in a shtetl would socialize, as in Fiddler, so willingly at a tavern. The house of study, the Beis Medrash, would be the more likely setting for Tevye and Lezer Wolf's public l'chaim. But as an adaptation, what does it say about the uses of the Tevye stories for an American audience? The scene shows us ultimately that the Jews of the shtetl, and especially Tevye, can learn to dance to the tune of the benign Cossacks also carousing in the tavern, and even learn to enjoy it. What better metaphor could there be for the comfortable culture of post-war American Jewry to describe itself? And who can deny either the attractiveness of the Cossack dancers or the utopian wishes of their toast? Heaven bless you, they sing. To your health, and may we live together in peace. Amen. The non-Jews in Fiddler echo the words of the Jewish characters, and in so doing, they universalize what the musical presents as Jewish values. Where the 1939 adaptation errs in exaggerating the differences between Jews and non-Jews to the point where they share no values or culture or even humanity in common, in Fiddler, we see that no meaningful difference separates the Jews and non-Jews of Anatevka, even in a context of anti-Semitism, expulsions, and pogrom. Both adaptations shortchange the complexity of Tevye and Sholem Aleichem's historical moment. Both adaptations, like all historical adaptations, use the Tevye stories as a metaphor for their current situation in the United States. And so studying them tells us more about the 1930s or the 1970s than the turn of the century Eastern Europe. For Schwarz's film, the Tevye stories serve as a parable for anti-Semitism at the brink of the Holocaust, where only communal solidarity and obedience to paternal wisdom, even illusory wisdom, can offer a measure of solace. For Fiddler, these same stories become a metaphor for the generation gap between suburban parents, the kind of people who patronize Broadway musicals, and their countercultural children. By the 70s, the notion of ethnic loyalty and religious parochialism had become the province of characters like Archie Bunker on All in the Family, who shares with Tevye a propensity toward bluster, harmlessly childish behavior, and malapropism. As with Archie Bunker, Tevye, by the end of Fiddler, learns his lesson and grudgingly blesses Chava's marriage to Chvedka, a development never envisioned either by Maurice Schwartz or Sholem Aleichem. By 1971, instead of the wisdom of the father being championed, it's the wisdom of the children that triumphs. By contrast, in Sholem Aleichem's original, neither the fathers nor the children have the last word. When Chava returns to Tevye at the end of the series, we never hear the details of their conversation, nor does Tevye inform us whether he accepts her back into the family or under what terms. More radically, after Chava's conversion, an event that is supposed to pain us as readers as much as it does Tevye as a character, we hear an even more astonishing confession from Tevye. The words, Kerachem av halbonim, like the mercy of a father for his children, kept running through my head. Could there be anywhere a child so bad that a father still couldn't love it? What torture to think that I was the only exception. What are you doing, you crazy old loon, I asked myself. Why are you making such a production of this? Stop playing the tyrant. Turn your wagon around and make up with her. I tell you, I had even weirder thoughts than that. What did being a Jew or not a Jew matter? Why did God have to create both? And if he did, why put such walls between them? It grieved me that I wasn't a more learned man, because surely there were answers to be found in the holy books. One suspects that even if Tevye were better educated in the holy books, he would still be searching for answers to these questions. Because what he has uncovered and what Sholem Aleichem in the original stories has dramatized is a fundamental and intractable problem. What is the ethical response when human values come into conflict with Jewish values? This is the fundamental question that the modern world poses to Jews, to Sholem Aleichem no less than to Tevye, and to today's Jews no less than to Sholem Aleichem. Both the Mari Schwartz Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof cut this Gordian knot by deciding cleanly on one side or the other. But I think we owe it to the complexity of the problem to return to Sholem Aleichem's original formulation, to let his ambivalence speak for our own age of uncertainty. For in the absence of an easy answer, nothing enlightens better than a comprehensive depiction of the problem. For a writer practiced in the art of language, ultimate wisdom can sometimes be articulated in silence. Thank you. We have time for questions? Please.
So at the beginning, I think you were referring to that Tevye lived in a village, not a shtetl.
Right.
So, but then in this later part of your discussion, you were saying, maybe it's the dramas that were produced, Tevye was.
Well, so in Fiddler on the Roof, there is no meaningful difference between village and shtetl. And, you hear this in the discourse of Jews of that generation. My parents came from a village. My parents came from... It wasn't a village. It was something different. And Tevye has a business relationship with the shtetl Anatevka. And there's actually, in the very last stories that Sholem Aleichem writes, the reflection of a contemporary political problem where the Tsar is debating whether to consider Anatevka a shtetl or a village. And the way that Sholem Aleichem dramatizes the actual expulsion of Tevye at the end of the story is that the Tsar has decided that Anatevka is a village and therefore Jews are not allowed to reside there. That really happened. Particularly in the last years of the Tsarist regime leading up to World War I. Jews were expelled from places where they had lived that had been considered to be shtetl because the Tsar says, well, no, they're villages, so you can't live there anymore. So those distinctions are of crucial importance to Sholem Aleichem, and they're lost to all the subsequent adaptations. Please. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that American Jews watching that would recognize it.
Sure.
It's really interesting how subtle it was. I mean, I bet non-Jews wouldn't even see it.
Oh.
I mean, he looked so, tentative.
Right.
And
Right.
And we all know that feeling. And I think it was really prescient of the producers to put that in there.
Absolutely. I mean, this gets back to my original point that the real star of the show is Jerome Robbins. That choreography was very consciously modeled on the choreography that Jerome Robbins produced for West Side Story. Except now, instead of the Italian and the Puerto Rican gangs using dancing for fighting, he revises it to show how Cossacks and Jews can coexist. And the reality is, this is what we would have liked for Jewish and non-Jewish relations to have been. We would like to have been able to intermingle the dance styles as harmoniously as Jerome Robbins does, But that attention also represents or literally embodies the discomfort as well as, they can dance to the same tune, but they're clearly different steps. Please.
Does this new Israeli production capture this ambivalence?
Well, it's not a new, it's a production that was mounted in the 1960s, and, I know the soundtrack of the original performance. I've never seen it performed on stage. Maybe I'll get a chance in New York this summer. But basically, translating Fiddler on the Roof back into Yiddish. I mean, it sounds so counterintuitive, right? It sounds like remember the comedian who used to smoke a cigarette? It's like going behind your head to get to to get back to your mouth. There are some things that the translation does better than the original does. If I were a rich man. So in the Yiddish version, wenn ich bin a Rothschild, it's more idiomatic and it's referring to a different Sholem Aleichem story to get at the same point. So I think that with all of these adaptations, there is a sense both of what it brings to the original that wasn't there before, the way that it adapts to its own purposes, and to produce Fiddler on the Roof, which is an American musical, in Israel, in Yiddish. You can't even call it nostalgia anymore. It's like nostalgia on steroids. It's like, it's not even, longing for a past that you never had. It is a fantasy of a past that you actually did have, but you prefer the fantasy. That's interesting. That's almost like a kind of zombie story, which is very different from our reception of Fiddler on the Roof, very comfortably residing in the conventions of the American musical comedy. This is returning those conventions to a context in which it had never existed before. So we'll see. Please. So here's what's important about this. That scene that I showed you for Fiddler on the Roof does not occur in the original story. But yes, not only were there Jewish tavern keepers, but that was a real institution, that Jews often were the tavern keepers. And the reality is that there's a whole genre of literature about Jewish tavern keepers, but less in Yiddish than in German. Because particularly in the Austrian Empire, in Galicia and in Bukovina, that's where the Jewish tavern keeper was a social institution. It wasn't just a demographic fact. It was also, the Jewish tavern keeper is part of the landscape, like the Ukrainian farmer, or like the Polish landowner, or like the German engineer. All of these character types fit into a hierarchy of ethnic difference that constitutes the eastern reaches of the Austrian Empire, which is both part and parcel of the Austrian Empire and the furthest extreme of that culture. So for German Jewish writers, that becomes a very conventional setting. For Yiddish writers, there are depictions of the tavern, but it's not a central location for Yiddish fiction because it's not in the shtetl. And again, there would be a Jewish tavern keeper who would probably be more afraid than Tevye that his daughters would run off with Ukrainian peasants. But a Jew would celebrate his l'chaim in the synagogue, in the Beis Medrash. That's where, because that's where that you'll be celebrating in the company of other Jews. This is a great way to celebrate the simcha without having to invite too many people as guests to the actual ceremony. Please.
I think in the beginning it was mentioned that the character Tevye doesn't seem to learn or grow from story to story. Yet in the later movie,
right.
he does. He learns tolerance until the very end.
Right.
He learns tolerance and patience and does seem to grow.
Right, because that's in the structure of movies. Movies have to bring that sense of character development to provide a sense of narrative and dramatic closure. As I say, Sholem Aleichem isn't writing for the movies. He's not writing a novel. He's more like writing for a TV series where, what crazy adventures are Homer and Marge going to get into this week? What crazy adventures is Tevye going to show for us this year? And the reality is that Sholem Aleichem's original readers, which were the international entirety of the Yiddish reading public, the Yiddish reading public loved Sholem Aleichem. He didn't receive respect from Yiddish literary critics until the end of his career. It's kind of a funny story, Sholem Aleichem, he writes humorous stories. He's a folk poet. He's a funny guy. But this is not serious literature. And then the Russian critics are saying, Tevye. Finally, the Jews have a character as rich and dramatic as Job or King Lear. Now, Job happens to be a character from Jewish literature, but let's not be petty, But when the Russian critics start calling Tevye the Jewish Job, the Jewish King Lear, then the Yiddish critics say, we knew it all along. He's our best writer. We love Sholem Aleichem. And he gains that prestige at the end of his career. But what Sholem Aleichem's characters to present to us are a sequence of hilarious misadventures. They don't present to us what we get from, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Turgenev or, we don't see characters developing over time. We see situations that dramatically represent a historical, a political, an existential situation. And that's really where Sholem Aleichem's genius resides.
I know there are a lot of hands up. We have time for one more question, and then we do have a reception. Everyone is invited, and we can continue the conversation there. So I'll let you pick.
You want to?
I was wondering how the straight play, The World of Sholem Aleichem,
Yes.
which debuted in the 50s
Yes.
in New York, paved the way for the later Fiddler on the
Right,
Roof
right.
and its success, and how authentic that was to the novel.
Right. Right. That's a somewhat complicated question, and there are theater historians and theater critics that have written very extensively about this. I'll say in general that there's a few ways in which it paves the way. There is a direct relationship between the world of Sholem Aleichem as a stage production in the 1950s and the subsequent musical adaptation, in the same way that, for example, Christopher Isherwood wrote I Am a Camera as a dramatic adaptation of his Berlin novels that later becomes cabaret. So there's that intermediate stage. So a couple of things that are interesting about that. First of all, there was a commercial success to this play, so it alerted the musical producers this could be something that could be really, this could be a viable property for us. Second, it was based on the same series of translations by Julius and Francis Butwin that the book for Fiddler on the Roof is based on. Another little side note, though, and I don't know the specifics of this, although I know that the scholarship has been done documenting this. The origins of that stage production, The World of Sholem Aleichem, come out of New York left-wing theater. And it was actors who had been blacklisted that were involved in that production. Any element of left-wing subversiveness that might have lingered in the stage production was completely excised from the musical adaptation. The musical adaptation is going for as mainstream and as congenial a consensus as was available on Broadway at that time. The stage play was a little bit more subversive, and there is somewhat of a precedence for this in Yiddish culture as well. In Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe after the October Revolution, after 1917, Eastern European Yiddish culture divides between what we can roughly call the Polish sector and the Soviet sector. The Polish sector claims as its inheritance Yud Lamed Peretz because he was a Polish Jewish writer, because he spoke to a kind of ethnic nationalism, non-Zionist but culturally autonomous Yiddish culture. The Soviet Union adapted for its model Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem in the Soviet vision was what was called a democratic writer, and that has a very specific connotation within the Soviet system. It means he was a writer who was aware of the contradictions of capitalism without living in an era where affiliation with the Communist Party was possible. So he was very majorly rehabilitated in the communist system. And American left-wing writers are picking up on that when they decide to adapt him to the stage. But that's, again, completely lost by the time we get to 1964, when McCarthyism is fortunately a dead letter and people have forgotten about how Sholem Aleichem could be used as a subversive writer.
Well,
thank you all.
Thank you again for uncovering remarkable layers, which I hope we can continue right next door at the reception. So many more questions, I know. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.